So welcome to section 3. We've looked at issues of perception and then issues of logic in previous sessions. This time we're going to look at persuasion. There are at least 3 units here. It could easily be more than that. Persuasion is a major topic when it comes to critical thinking. We're going to start this first unit is looking at the issue of language. So if I can just get my screen to come up. Persuasion starts with language. And what does that mean? Language is how we primarily, and I'm going to talk about what else is going on, primarily how we encode our efforts to shape the feelings, thinking, and actions of others. That is, we use words to change the people around us. We use words to achieve what we're trying to accomplish in the world. We use words to do practically everything that is human. Except it's not the only way that we try and change and shape the world around us. That is, there are other things like music or violence, force, images. That is, human beings are sensitive to many forms of input. Language is one of the most powerful, though, because language is most easily focused. That is, if I hit my child to get them to stop doing something, am I actually getting them to stop doing things or getting them to be more secretive, to run away, to learn to hit? There's so many things that could be going on. But if I speak, I can be focused and targeted. It's not a good example, but it shows you just how powerful it can be. We use music to shape our emotions, to shape our feelings. We do that quite a lot. But that doesn't necessarily help us really achieve the things we want to achieve in life. That is, to do that, we need to be targeted. We need to be focused. And language is our best way of doing that. So it turns out it is our primary way. In evolutionary terms, it may turn out that language is key to the evolution of the human species. That is, our brains function or came to be larger because we found that communicating effectively worked for survival, and that we could communicate more effectively with larger brains. It just is in a feedback cycle between communication and brain growth that led to the species that we are now. Well, that's hypothetical. Something went on. Things have happened. Whatever it is, though, we have these amazing language skills, and they're critical to the way we function as human beings. So that's the starting place. But I'm going to also be working with the philosophy of Michel Meyer, a Belgian rhetorician. Rhetoric is the study of language and how we use it. Meyer has some fascinating ideas that I find extraordinarily useful. The rest of this presentation on persuasion is built around standard models of persuasion put together in the context of Meyer's models of rhetoric. So I use Meyer's ideas as foundational to everything else. There's a participant I wish I had here. One of my close friends is a rhetorician herself. And we've had some good conversations about Meyer's work, and I would really be interested in what she would have to say about this. But mostly I think she would agree with me in terms of what I'm going to do, but with some nuances that I think would make for interesting conversation. But she's not here, and you're stuck with me. So I highly recommend reading the work of Meyer. He is a philosopher. He is a philosopher who writes in French. He is a philosopher who writes in bad French, which means he's very difficult to translate. His translators regularly throw up their hands and say, I don't even know what he means. But if you start digging and really reading his stuff, there's a certain sense to it. You miss a lot of the nuances because he writes in bad French, colloquial Belgian French, not French French. So it's not easy, but his work is so interesting. I think I've been working with his ideas now for a number of years. I find they've just transformed my ability to think about the world, think about what I'm doing, thinking about what's happening around me. So I'm going to introduce you to some of Meyer's key ideas about language so that we can understand how persuasion takes place. So that's where I'm going to go next, and that's where I'm going to spend the rest of my session. is talking about Meyer's ideas about language and how they function. It's only 2 more slides, but they take quite some time to go through. So language is how we encode our efforts to shape the world, shape feelings, thinking, and actions of others. It's how we come to, in fact, understand ourselves. But what does that mean? So for that, we turn to the ideas of Meyer. What Meyer says is that at the heart of language is that we are responding to experiential gaps. Now, what he means by that is that our world is mostly coherent. It makes sense. We live our lives, we get things done, things happen. And we don't need a lot of words for our ordinary activities. We just carry them out by habit, that the words themselves simply become signs and symbols, part of the background context. They aren't things that we really focus on. That is, language itself comes into play when we face a problem. So his fundamental work is called Problematology. It is understanding language as the application of, or understanding of, or work with problems. That is, as we've got problems, we then try to develop solutions, and language is how we do that. It's not clear to me if we use anything besides language in a coherent way, but human beings are known for doing many things to solve problems besides language. But it's the coherent exploration of problems, as far as I can tell, that is essential to language. So we have gaps in our world, things that don't work, things that just whatever, leading us to a sense that there's a problem, and from which we construct language, or work to use language, or immerse ourselves in language, or struggle with language, lots of things. But that's where language itself comes from. Now, according to Meyer, what's critical in this is to note that this is a social practice. We do not do language on our own. That is, we always function in the context of, well, existing answers. So the world we live in, we can think of it in Meyer's terms as simply a collection of answers. So everything from an iPhone to a street sign to your chat with your friend is something done that is framed by existing answers, technological answers, social answers, cultural answers, family answers. You've got answers, things that work, they make sense. And we just live in them, converse, explore, whatever, in the context of existing answers. They're strong, they're clear, they work. We know how they function, they're reliable. So we've got all these answers, and they are the fundamental framework from which we experience gaps. That is, the gap has to be a gap in an answer. It is somewhere there's an answer that isn't quite working for us, or no longer works for us, or circumstances have changed and now we're trying to figure out what might work better. Lots of things that lead to us, but they're all framed by existing answers, a social context of existing answers. And then what is key point is, but answers and our questions also emerge in the context of other questioners and answerers. That is, there are people around us who are asking their own questions, who are developing their own answers, or developing answers to other people's questions, or, and it goes on and on. That what we're looking at is a dynamic process. I don't have a slide for this, but I think the way to think of it is that our language is an emergent outcome of a social process of questions and answers. I'd like to, I got to put together a slide for that. So what we're looking at, though, is the key idea is that language emerges in a social context of answerers, questioners, and existing answers that create the environment from which and out of which and in which we are working to express our own language. So again, that's all Meyer. Now I have a diagram that I want to spend the rest of our time exploring. So this kind of puts it together. I could put a more complex image together. I do have more complex versions of this slide because Meyer's work is quite complex, but I've tried to simplify it for the purposes of this presentation, just bring it down to the essence. So if we follow his thinking, what we can say is that language starts right here in a perceived gap in answers or potentially other unresolved needs. That is, we've got a problem. That is, our answers aren't working, our situation isn't working. Somebody somewhere has a perceived gap. Now, is it an actual gap? Might be, might not be. That's a different issue. So we go back to the issue of perceptions and how do people perceive, if we want to explore that. But regardless, if people perceive a gap, then they begin acting. Okay, so that's a starting place. Back up behind it is what, in Meyer's terms, are apodictic or nominally apodictic answers or apocritical answers. Anyway, we won't worry about the language so much, but they're answers that appear to be solid, but they're not solid enough. That is, the nominally means they're pretty good. They seem to have worked, at least to an extent, but they're not perfect. They don't give us all the answers. They don't give us all the responses that we need to handle our current situation. That's why they're nominally so, leading to this perceived gap. That's the background. Now, one other piece here, these nominally apodictic answers are all somehow tied to language itself. That doesn't mean we're directly experiencing the language. We're actually experiencing the outcome of those answers, not the answers themselves, nor whatever words or concepts those answers are framed in. So if I'm using an iPhone, I don't need to worry about the questions that produced an iPhone. I just use it. It is nominally a solid piece of technology that I can use as a reliable part of my environment. So it is an iPhone is a nominally apodictic answer, except sometimes it doesn't work. You can get out of range of a cell tower. And now all of a sudden you've got a gap and you have to start thinking and questioning. So it's like, it can be a technology or it can be a concept. I'm looking at the world around me and I see something flying through the air and it doesn't look like an airplane. So I go, well, what is it? And I start grappling for what kind of language, what kind of concept might be to explain this thing I've never seen before. Or I might be looking for a job and I'm going, okay, what am I going to do next? I didn't like my last job. So now I have to start thinking, well, what are jobs? Who am I? What are my skills? Those are all language concepts that allow us to think about the world and frame what was a good answer. Well, I really enjoyed this part of that job. Okay, so that was a good thing. And you're thinking and you're assessing and you're working on what are the concepts, what are the language that emerges. That is, this perceived gap, something went wrong here. That is, it was a good enough answer at one point. I know it's flying through the sky. I know what my phone will allow me to do. I know what my job will allow me to do. We have nominal answers that allow us to assess our world relatively, and it seems to work most of the time, except sometimes I get out of range. Whatever I'm seeing doesn't look like an airplane. Oh, I need a new job. All these things are gaps that lead us then to language. Why? Because we want to resolve the gap. We want to stop the gap. We want a better job. We want to understand, what did we see? We want to know that if we're out of range of the cell tower, well, what do we do to resolve a problem if we have an emergency? So we're looking for gap resolution. That is the fundamentals of it. But how do we do it? We do it by asking ourselves questions. That is, we look for language. What can explain what we're experiencing? What are the terms that we've got that will allow us to make sense of our world, to make sense of our question and frame it well? So we end up looking for, taking, or making up language to express our gap in our quest for that gap's resolution. And part of the process here is we will make up new words. That is, language itself emerges from this process. That is, if I cannot find existing words that explain or help me resolve my gap, then I'm going to go looking for new words. And this is one of the core drives behind language itself. If you start looking at how words come into existence, you'll realize words are dragged into existence by people trying to express something, and they don't have current words. But one of my favorite examples is the word software. Where did the word software come from? Because this is really interesting. Software is nothing but a collection of ones and zeros, and that's nothing at all. Yet in our digital world, we have to have something that explains the packages of ones and zeros so that we can talk about them in meaningful ways, distribute them, use them, understand what's going on. It's not hardware. Well, that's the machinery. Okay, but it's necessary. Is it a tool? Yeah, but that doesn't quite explain what it is. It's more like the hardware itself in that, okay. And you can see somebody sitting there hitting on one day software. Instead of hardware, then there's software. And then you'll find out there's an interesting extension of that to human beings. Human beings are now sometimes called wetware, following the same basic pattern of thinking. That is, we're trying to understand what is going on to make things function. Software doesn't tell us anything that it's a collection of ones and zeros, but does give us a sense of, metaphorically, of something that isn't hardware, and yet it's wares, things we can sell, things we can buy, things we use to do things. Hardware we use, we all understand that. Software now becomes a new word that allows us to explain what we're doing with all these ones and zeros that our digital world requires, our packaged, coherent, organized ones and zeros. So we're just selling ones and zeros. But if I say I have a package of ones and zeros, and somebody can say, well, I can make up my own package of ones and zeros. I don't need yours. But how do I explain how you want to run something? How you want to do something on a repeated basis in a way that makes sense and it's easy to use? I have to package it somehow. I have to find a word that allows me to put it together in a box. So what would that word box look like? And I come up with software. And using the word software, I can now say, well, this is what it is. We're selling software. Okay. Well, what is software? Well, here it is. Here's my package of word processing software, my spreadsheet software, my app for finding the best restaurants, whatever. It's my package of ones and zeros. It's software. And there we go. So my quest to resolve the gap means applying language, but it can mean the creating language. That is, we're right here at the source of language itself. That as we struggle with problems, we start looking for language. And then we can create a question. That is, once we've got the words, we can create the question with which we can begin to explore the world around us. Without the language, our question might not be a good question. It might be an inaccurate question, one that leads in many directions. And I'm sure all of you have been in experiences where you're going, oh goodness, that was not the right thing to say. I could have said it better. That is, there are ways that are more effective than others, and finding the right words is about getting ourselves to that place where we're actually using the words that will help us think best. So we're looking for good questions, and good language gets us to good questions. One of my points about teaching and in the MBA program is that what I'm doing is I'm just teaching language. I'm just teaching concepts so that students can then go out and use language to explore the world around them. That is, I'm not teaching answers. I'm not teaching anyone how to run a good business, because I'm not. Would never dream to think that I'm teaching that. But ideally, I'm teaching students the concepts, that is the language with which, when they've got problems, they can start figuring out how to express those problems well. They can explain what's going on in that problem. They can then look for effective solutions, more effective solutions than they would come up with otherwise. So that all I'm doing is giving language. You can, in fact, get the same language by reading a textbook. The problem being that without a person on the other end of the line, other end of the screen, in front of you in the classroom, without that person, it's hard to know what those words mean. That is, there's a human component to understanding language, to be able to prioritize, to know what is the best language. So there's you can't just get there by reading a textbook. Not a bad idea, but it isn't good enough. We need people in that. But that's all it is. It's just about how do you find the language? What's the right language? How do you use the language to express a problem? That's all I'm teaching. It's all we do at that level is teach questions through language. How do you put it together? What are you looking at? Well, how are you going to develop an answer without the right questions? And so that is what I'm teaching. So all of it is about questioning the world effectively and accurately through language. Or is it? No, it actually goes a little bit further than that. And this is Meyer's point, is that if we stop there, we're actually missing something significant. He says this is a social existence. We are not solitary. We do not do this on our own. This is all done in dialogue. Dialogue with our culture, dialogue with our friends, dialogue with our coworkers, dialogue with the world at large. It's all dialogic. So when we ask a question, we're not asking them neutrally. And this is where we're going to get to persuasion next week. That is, we're asking questions of answerers, which could in fact be ourselves, but could be anybody. That is, all of our questions are about getting an answer. That is about persuading people that our question is important. That is, at the heart of our language, it isn't just that we are constructing language for ourselves. It is we're constructing our language in the context of other people and what they're trying to accomplish. We need them on our side. So then we get to persuasion. But regardless, Meyer's model is we're doing this socially. We're doing this in the context of others. That is, when I ask a question, I am asking a question of a person. And I need to think in terms of their personhood, their social location, what else is happening around them as I am working with them so that I can get an answer. And then the answer again comes from language. There should be a little bit, another arrow here that moves again dotted into the world of language. It is the answerer might have all the language necessary, and often does, but the answerer also might be, in fact, constructing language in order to answer your question. It can go in many different ways. That is, in a certain sense, all answers have the potential to be creative engagements with language again, just like the question seeks to find or create the words that allows itself to be best expressed. The answerer needs to find the language that will best express an answer, usually taken from existing language. But they might look at other language, might create new words themselves. Excuse me. So what we've got here, if we want to look at it, is that both questioners and answerers are functioning in a world of language, but it's a cloud. There is no solid box of language. You cannot use a dictionary in terms of understanding language. Dictionaries are helpful, but as I often advise students who are working in English as a second language, a dictionary should always be your second line, never your first line of trying to understand. First, try to understand from context. That is, always look at questioners and answerers and what's going on in that context if you want to understand what a word means. If you understand the context and you still don't understand the language, then a dictionary can be helpful, but you need to use it cautiously. Dictionary definitions are an attempt to create an uncontested version of what the language is. But our reality is such that no language is ever uncontested. We're always pushing language around. We're always changing what a word means. So a dictionary is always a tentative tool. Language is a cloud, not a box, and not a book. So what we've got is this realm of language, this fuzzy cloud, with questioners and answerers pushing that cloud around, reshaping that cloud in their efforts to figure out what is the right way of expressing their perceived gap or need, and then what is the right way of expressing an answer to that gap or need. And then all of this takes place in the realm of socially developed, uncontested answers. So there's a box here as well. We could probably, for the sake of this exercise, drop that box, but I wouldn't want to, because it's always important to remember that whatever you're asking, whatever you're saying, it's always in the context of somebody else's, some larger history and cultural context of answers. And you can never really ignore that. Even if the situation is immediate and personal, the language you're speaking itself is coming out of this larger, socially uncontested framework of meaning and words. So maybe you don't need to pay attention to it. Maybe you do. Just be aware that there's always that larger social framework. So the point here is to get to persuasion. That is, how is persuasion part of this? If you're watching this closely, it should be relatively clear that persuasion is something that is happening at every level here. That is, as a questioner, I have to be persuaded that there's something meaningful going on in my experience. Something has to happen that's significant enough to adjust my thinking, get me to reworking my ideas, what I think is going on in the world. And the answer has to do the same. They have to be persuaded this is a significant problem that's worth responding to. You don't just go, ah, but you take it seriously and you start thinking, looking for language. That is, you have to be persuaded there's something meaningful. And then, what is the gap resolution about? Isn't that about persuading your world to somehow resolve that gap? Anyway, so that's where we'll be going in subsequent sessions, is looking at that persuasion itself. We're going to look at the 3 uses of language. That's next week, and how persuasion is one of the 3 primary uses, and exactly what that means. And then the following week, how rhetoric expresses persuasion effectively, and then how to think about it. So I'm going to wrap up there, say that is enough content, a lot of content pretty quickly, some pretty heavy thinking there, and then open it up for discussion. So I will stop the recording.